Hold it! Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! Now, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
Hey, you're listening to another episode of Threshold Saints. This is Jin The Ninja, and enjoy the show. Hey, so I'm joined by another fellow esoterica Buddhist, awesome political commentator, and just like cool Twitter personality at Jigoku Cake. And this is not a continuation of our previous conversation, which appeared on the Subconscious Realms feed, but it is kind of a continuing, ongoing conversation about the nature of Tantra and its like relationship between like the Himalayan tantric sort of schools and Japanese esoteric Buddhism. So I'll just let Jigoku Cake plug all his amazing work and Substack and books and everything, and then we'll start. Hey Jigoku, how are you doing?
I'm doing fabulous. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thank you. Really glad to be in conversation again and really looking forward to it and really appreciate that you came on.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
So why don't you just give a brief overview of like what you're about, all your stuff that you have. I know you've got quite a few links, which I will all include in the show notes and all of that, but just give people like a plug of who you are and what your kind of mission or like ethos is in what you're posting and what you're doing online.
Yeah, I guess I'm just online, like on my Twitter account and stuff. I'm just kind of a shit poster. But I kind of developed a fascination with certain topics, and with Buddhism being one of the biggest ones. And I do a lot of posts about that. They call it effort posting as opposed to shit posting. So more long form stuff. Within the Twitter format. But my more polished stuff is on Substack. I have a Substack called Spiral Seas that I update very sporadically, just kind of whenever I feel like it. It's got a lot of content up on it now. I had I did several kind of book length things that I ended up uploading onto there, and one of which was like a really long essay series. And what we're going to be talking about today is another essay series that was only 3 parts, as opposed to, I don't know how long the other one was. It was like 15 or something. But we're going to be talking about the 3-part essay today. And what else do I have? I also have some self-published public domain Buddhist books under the label Hungry Ghost Books. You can find those on Amazon. I have a Gumroad page too. It's linked in my Twitter bio. That's Jigoku Cake. So that's Jigoku Cake, Cake. Pretty sure I got that right.
No,
and,
awesome.
I think that's it.
Yeah, and I will link all of this into the show notes so people can obviously check you out and subscribe to your Substack and all that stuff. And you're a great Twitter poster anyway, so like yes, go read, especially because what we're going to cover is derived from your Substack, so people really should go and read that, especially the 3-part series on the Vajra-Peak Sutra, which is honestly phenomenal, like really, and groundbreaking as well, because there's very little. There are people doing it, like I know you cited David Gray and a few other kinds of scholars doing kind of like this epistemology or like forensic epistemology of like relationships between the translations, but it is pretty uncommonly studied, especially in English, maybe more in Japanese or more in Chinese or more in Tibetan, but definitely not in English. So I think this is very cool at what you've done, very like seminal, if you want to say that. And everybody should go read that for sure, because it will really give you a base of what we're going to talk about. And of course, we won't do it like crazy high level. We'll just do it like normal human beings. But, you know, when we refer to something, it'll pretty much be from the essays. So, well, why don't you start us off, Jigoku, with sort of an introduction of what the Vajra-Peak Sutra is, how it relates to Japanese esoteric Buddhism. I know that's a huge question. You wrote a three-part essay on it, but just like a brief overview of who brought it to Japan, what its relationship is to Tantra, anything you want to add. And obviously, I have my own notes that I will bring in as needed.
Yeah. So, well, obviously, Tantra started in India, along with that's where Buddhism's from. It gets, just as like a very like general overview, it got brought to China, and China kind of acted as a nexus for all of East Asia, like spreading this stuff around. So it got spread to the Korean Peninsula and to the Japanese islands. So Tantra follows that same model. It got brought to China by a few very, very intelligent men who translated these texts to Chinese. A few of those being kind of in Kukai, who is one of the primary tantric Buddhist masters in Japanese history. A few of those translators were basically started his lineage that he adopted and brought to Japan. So the primary texts of Japanese tantric Buddhism are the Vajra-Peak Sutra, which is the one I wrote the three-part essay about, and then the Mahavajrayana Sutra, which it's kind of it has a different history as far as the translator. It has a different translator from the Vajra-Peak Sutra. But those were put together by the people who taught Kukai into like a kind of coherent, a cohesive theology involving these two texts that aren't directly related to each other, but thematically. And then he brought that to Japan, and so Shingon Buddhism, which is what is known as today, which was started by Kukai, their theology revolves around these two scriptures and the mandalas that were made from them. So that's a very, very general kind of overview of esoteric Buddhism in Japan. I mean, you're going to know, just from that, you're going to know more than like 90% of people on this topic. But we're going to dive into it a little bit further.
No, 100%. You're totally right. And, for my audience, I mean, for whatever audience that I have, they actually are mostly, there's a lot of people who are even more knowledgeable about Tantra than me. So they are going to be pretty much at intermediate level. But I will just say, like, even as like a Tibetan tantric, Japanese esoteric Buddhism is still very challenging in some ways, because the view, capital V, the view often changes. And we'll get into this about the idea of the transgressive ritual and how it is definitely more frowned upon in Japan than it was in Tibet, where it is kind of like the soteriological basis for most kinds of practices.
Yeah.
So, but that's a very interesting thing. And I think you did a great introduction on the topic. And what do you think is, this is going to be a huge question, but I'm just going to ask it. What do you think is the difference between the esoteric and esoteric, like, flavors? Like, what do you think really differentiates them, and what do you think makes them the same? Because I know that you did an amazing quote by Shinjo, I believe that's who it was, in your second part series, which we might get back to if you don't want to answer this right now, but that's okay. But I just thought for a thought experiment for people who are listening, or for you, if you want to answer it, that's totally fine. But I just think it's an interesting idea, like, what is transgressive versus normative? What is heterodox versus orthodox? And because the lines often get blurred in Tantra. So I just think, yeah, just consider that as kind of a working thesis moving forward. So,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I didn't mean to, go on for so long for that, but.
Oh, no, that's fine. So that is kind of a tricky question because a lot of people. So with Japanese Buddhism, it's I mean, despite some kind of interesting history around priests doing some morally dubious things in Japan, which, I mean, that happens all over the world when you have like religious institutions. Uh, Typically, Japanese Buddhism is associated with monastic discipline. And I mentioned in the last podcast I did with you about the Kamakura period and how it had a lot of more these new schools coming up that could be considered very populist in comparison to the older schools.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that had to do with the monastic discipline kind of falling out of favor within the old schools and people kind of picking up on that. And these things kind of ebb and flow, where monastic discipline is considered a higher priority with some schools at different points. But generally speaking, it's very, the flavor of Japanese Buddhism is more in line with general Mahayana, instead of the more transgressive tantric elements. And that can be considered the same with the Mikyo or the esoteric practices. But there are some interesting differences between the mainline Mahayana sects and the esoteric ones. So there's, I think I mentioned this before, but the Rishukyo is a very highly regarded text in Shingon Buddhism. It's recited, I think, daily by some schools. And it's very much more in line with the later tantric stuff that got adopted in Tibet, where it kind of regards rather than being a rejection of the five senses and the transformed world, it kind of embraces it as kind of like in the kind of a non-dualistic way. So theologically, there are definitely hints. Well, not even hints of it. There are themes that are prominent themes that are more in line with the Tibetan tantric stuff. But as far as there people know about like there's like sexual practices and things like that in the later tantric works.
Mm-hmm.
Those were never transmitted to Japan. As far as I know, like not even like later on, I don't think they were transmitted. Even when you get into like the kind of theories around the Tachikawa Ryu and like the heretical schools that were banned, I don't even think they had access to these later tantric works that were popularized in like Tibet and Mongolia and things like that. It wasn't really until kind of more modern day that these works like Goya Samaja started becoming more studied in Japan, and it's really just in an academic sense rather than theological.
That was an amazing response, honestly. I know it's a huge question, and you did a great job of answering that.
Oh, thank you.
I actually do have a quick note on the Rishokyo, and I just thought it was so interesting when you wrote about, I think you're quoting David Gray, and maybe it's not, I might be incorrect, but I believe that's true. And you talked about how he kind of classified the four families into the four implements. So he said desire was an arrow, sense was a vajra or a trishul, lust was a makara, pride was a corpse or a man. So I just thinking back to my experience in Tibetan Buddhism, well, that totally makes sense for yoga tantra. So you would have like desire being the arrow of Taki Raja, or maybe Kurukula if you're thinking a higher Buddhist deity. Sense, the Trishul, that's definitely Mahakala. Lust, the Makara, you have Rahula Dza, who's a very important protector for Nyingma. And then the pride or the corpse you would have for Ekajati or the one-eyed Tara. So also a very important protector for the Nyingma school. So you definitely have these ideas that are sort of transnational, sort of, I don't know, they're definitely there, even if it's not interpreted in such a ferocious, wrathful activity sort of way. I think that the ideas are just seeds, and then they get bloomed differently in the different countries. That's kind of my idea.
Oh yeah, very very much so. I think you nailed it with that. And as far as I think the that passage that you were talking about, that goes that's from the Rishukyo, mainly the Rishukyo mandala. So there's like a one of the primary. So I mentioned there are two mandalas in Shingon Buddhism. There's and the one based off the Vajra-Peak Sutra it has 9 panels. So it's 9 like smaller mandala that make up one big one. One of those is based off the Rishukyo. It's the Rishukyo mandala. And I believe there's 16 main deities in there, and they have the implements that you mentioned. And this is kind of important to the topic that we're going to get into in a little bit here, the Vajra-Peak Sutra cycle, or rather the theorized 100,000 line version of the Vajra-Peak Sutra, because the Rishukyo is theorized to be the 6th part of or the 6th main like chapter, we could say. They call them meetings in the documents that Kukai and Amoghavajra wrote about these, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But so it's actually considered to be, in this sense, if we take these theories at face value, the Rishukyo is literally connected to later tantric works. So you can draw like a straight line from the Rishukyo to these other ones. So like you said, we have this seed of an idea that takes on different forms depending on where it goes.
Yeah, I think that is completely true. I think you can see the older kinds of ideas because the Nyingma is obviously considered the old school. And then you also have like how those would be interpreted in the Sarma schools, so the new schools. And you see quite an overlap, but you do see even in the Tibetan schools differences in how the implements are interpreted, which would be the outer meaning. So the outer meaning is the kind of like it's people misunderstand when I say outer meaning, but it's really all the memorization that you have to do, all the like the deity holds this implement and it means this thing. That's all the outer meaning. So I just think there is slight differences, but honestly, it's very similar. And you can see that it's just different kinds of like interpretations of the same sort of pattern recognition, the same view.
Yeah.
And I think that through the whole discussion, we will see these kinds of ideas kind of like arise. Like I know that you quoted the Jaitan Rapo article, Heresy and Liminality in Esoteric Buddhism.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to read like a quick little thing about it. Kukai had he had a fear of space pervading perversions. So this idea of like the lineage holder worrying about the sort of the corruption of the seeds of knowledge that he was in fact in charge of bringing to Japan.
Yep.
I just think that's very interesting because you see this idea in Tibetan Buddhism coming up very frequently. This idea that the teacher is like aloof and reserved, but that the same sort of thing that he's also concerned with who is going to transmit his teachings, in what way they're going to translate it, and how they are going to be understood.
Yep, exactly. And it's not that like that's not an unfounded fear either. I mean, we see all the time, especially in like America, we see these like different self-styled gurus coming up with these, they get a few tantric ideas and then they start these weird like cults and like quasi-religious groups, and then they're always like corrupt. They always end up becoming corrupted at least, and there's always like ulterior motives on the part of these self-styled gurus, and they always turn into like sex stuff and everything. I mean, we see it all the time. There's like tons of Netflix documentaries out right now, like studying different cults and everything. You just see this stuff over and over and over again, and it's like that was. I mean, people knew about that this stuff would happen like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. It's never gone away.
No, you're totally correct, and it is interesting to just think about that. Sex tantra is really one limb of yoga. Like you were saying, how those transgressive sexual practices never really got brought to Japan, and they get way overemphasized in the West. I'm sure you're familiar with my take on this, is that they get way overemphasized in the West, like way overemphasized. It doesn't mean that they don't exist, but it just means that it's one limb of yoga. So it's subsidiary to the greater text, to the greater cycles of text. It's not a core practice. Now, it can be a core practice if we lived in like 1852, pre-modern times, right? I mean, there were dakini consorts, human dakini consorts. Obviously, there's an idea of the esoteric dakini consort as well, but in this context, I mean a human dakini consort. So there are people that were dakini consorts, but the reality is like the discipline, the self-discipline, and the knowledge, and the how much empowerment and lineage kind of transmission you need to do sexual tantra it would almost be impossible in this day and age to do it correctly, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that I don't think that's like a I don't think that's like a rare opinion either, as far as like the idea of a certain amount of kind of moral decline in like the fabric of humanity. That's a very kind of common Buddhist thing.
Yes, it is, isn't it? And you actually cite a really interesting I think quotation about it by Shinjo, and you also laid out a very interesting, I thought, observation where you said how important it was after you had finished the Guhya Samaja and the commentary, that you said how important it was to treat tantra as kind of building blocks rather than kind of texts that just exist in the ether by themselves, and you can just derive your whole cosmological and sociological view of them through those texts. But it's really so much more than that. They really exist in a cosmology with each other, like in relationship.
Oh yeah,
great observation.
Yeah, and yeah, these things. There are certain things within Buddhism. I think people might mistake this because other religions aren't necessarily like this, and other kind of spiritual topics. But Buddhism isn't really something where you could just dive into any thread and immediately understand it and get where it's coming from. It's very you have to have a certain context when you're reading some things. One of the first books that I tried to read when I developed an interest in Buddhism was actually the Vajra-Peak Sutra. Like I said, one of the primary texts of Shingon. If you just try to, like, without any knowledge whatsoever of Buddhism, just pick up that book and then start reading it, your eyes are gonna glaze over immediately. You're not gonna know what the hell you're reading. But it goes deeper than that, like you said. There's certain ideas and concepts that can only be understood in certain contexts. And commentaries are one of the ways that people communicate this, but mainly it's through teachers. That's the traditional means through which that's done. But of course, you're going to need a certain amount of to even begin to understand the esoteric sutras and things like that. You need exoteric knowledge as well.
No, you're totally 100%. I mean, I can't really even add to that. It was like so well articulated. How important is the role of the transmission teacher in Japanese Buddhism, just as a general sort of figure? Because the guru is probably the focus of the central pillar of Tibetan Buddhism. I would say the guru is the most important, but you also have obviously the other pillars in Buddhism, which is the Deva, the Dakini, sometimes the Dharmapala. But in your opinion, like how important is the guru for Japanese Buddhism?
Well, I can't say through like any first-hand experience or anything. I haven't been initiated into any like Buddhist sects or anything like that. But what I do know is that just from reading history and studies and things on Shingon and Tendai and such, that the esoteric groups in Japan are very concerned about recording lineages and things like that. So there is like an idea that you need to have a proper lineage if you're going to be practicing these as like, in like a official kind of, context.
No.
I mean, there's like lay followers obviously aren't expected to have like a direct master, and there are some lay practices, like there's guides and stuff that Shingon groups will put out talking about like different daily practices that lay followers can do. But in general, yeah, if you're going to be practicing this stuff as like member of the clergy, they are very still concerned about lineage and being properly initiated. Maybe some of like the other groups, like, I mean, I haven't studied this in too much depth, but I imagine that some like a group like Jodo Shinshu, which is like one of the Pure Land groups, is the biggest Pure Land group, might be a little less concerned about these things, but I don't know. I'd have to research that more. But as far as the esoteric groups go, yeah, they are concerned about lineage.
Awesome. Okay, I know that was a somewhat of a more challenging question, but you dealt with it really well. I wanted to bring that up in relation to the role of Nagarjuna in terms of the Vajra-Peak Sutra, and just how I was surprised to sort of see his name come up, because he is obviously so important within Tibetan Buddhism and Indian Buddhism.
Yep.
And to have that like sort of Japanese esoteric connection is very interesting to me. So would you kind of get into that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, this was when I wanted to bring this topic up. So I'm glad you did. So this we're going to actually get into the nitty gritty in the Vajra-Peak Sutra cycle here. The general legend behind this group of texts is that it was given to one of the sources I quoted said it was like a great worthy or something is how to describe this person. A person of great intellect, of great, high faculty. They were granted entrance into this magical iron stupa. And when they got in there, they were given these texts and special teachings associated with them. So these would be the esoteric texts, like the Mahavajrayana Sutra and the Vajra-Peak Sutra. So they were initiated by deities, the deities themselves, who, bestowed the bodhisattvas and such, bestowed these teachings upon this person. And then they went out and they were the start of this lineage in proper. So on researching who this person is, Kukai himself claimed that it was Nagarjuna, who if there's anyone who follows my Twitter, knows that Nagarjuna is the person who is credited with bringing the Mahayana sutras from the Naga palaces, well after Shakyamuni's passing. So this is kind of a really important point, because in Japan, before Kukai brought over the esoteric Buddhist text, it was the Mahayana Buddhist sects that were like the biggest ones. I mean, there were like some kind of Theravada adjacent ones, probably still at this time. They don't exist much anymore. But it was, there were a lot of Mahayana based Buddhist groups, and their claim to legitimacy came from this story about these texts coming from the Nagas, basically being written down in Shakyamuni's time, stored at the Naga palaces, retrieved by Nagarjuna, and then he started this kind of like Mahayana Buddhism in general that we know. So the idea that these esoteric texts also came from Nagarjuna kind of lends a certain amount of authenticity to it. If you're saying, like, well, these texts came from the same place as yours, then obviously that's going to be kind of an important thing when you're trying to spread them around a place where Mahayana Buddhism has already taken root. And we can see like kind of the kind of like argument against this actually from Nichiren. So Nichiren is another person I mentioned last time I was on the podcast with you, but I'll do a brief explainer on him. So he was a kind of I would describe him as a Lotus Sutra supremacist. So the Lotus Sutra is one of the main Mahayana sutras, especially in Japan and East Asian Buddhism. And Nichiren saw the Lotus Sutra as the highest possible sutra because, well, within the text itself, if you actually go back and read it, it says basically this is the highest sutra, copy this sutra instead of the other ones, stuff like that. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. but it will, that textually, if you're reading this in like a very literal sense, it says, this is the highest teaching that we're going to teach to you. So Nichiren took this very literally and was a kind of Lotus Sutra supremacist, as I said. So he kind of took issue with this idea that the esoteric sutras came from Nagarjuna, and in his writing, he actually said that Kukai was a liar and that he had made up this story. I don't think Kukai actually, this story directly came from Kukai. It probably came from his teachers. But it also means, so if Kukai's story is true, then one could make the argument that the Lotus Sutra, back when it was revealed by Nagarjuna originally, then maybe it was the highest teaching back then. But under the esoteric Buddhist legend, Nagarjuna kept these tantric teachings secret for a really long time, and then later on they were revealed by other people. So theoretically, you can make the argument, oh well, yeah, maybe the Lotus Sutra was like the best back then, but after it was time for the tantric teachings that came out, they like superseded it. So that was you could see that as like kind of like a theological sticking point at for people like Nichiren, which and I once again I recommend Nichiren's writing to anybody who's into like theological squabbles like that. His writing is like filled with stuff like that, which is really interesting. But so that's kind of the story behind it and the kind of context that we're talking about in Japanese Buddhism.
One thing I particularly loved about the story was the text being lost at sea. I wrote that down specifically. And you see this a lot in, and especially in the higher yoga tantras, this idea of the yoga tantras being thrown into the supernal ocean. And in fact, there's even a Puranic story. So now I'm referring to what we call Hinduism. It's not really Hinduism, but we're just going to call it that. But there's a Puranic story about how Shiva's son, Subramanya or Murugan or Skanda, he has many names, but Skanda is one name. He throws the Vamacharya text into the supernal waters after he defeats a certain asura. And this refers to all, even though it's a Puranic story, it's referring to all, both Buddhist and quote unquote Hindu left-handed practices. And then it's Masendranath, who is one of the 9 Nath yogis, the first of the 9 yogis. He is swallowed by a giant whale and retrieves the text. So it's one text, but it's all the text. It's like the seed of knowledge, we could say, but contained in a text. And he brings that to dry land, and then he is able to kind of pass on some of these more earlier, very like maybe proto-tantric, or even though he's not really a proto-tantric, he is like a true tantric, but maybe just the practices, just like you're saying with the Lotus Sutra, it kind of precedes what Tantra became later on. So I just find that idea of the supernal or the ocean lost in the sea, like that seems to have a deeper sort of metaphysical and metaphorical layer than just, oh, I lost the text in the sea.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if that played into it. I mean, it's possible that I mean, we don't know where the story about, so the story that you're referring to is Amoghavajra's teacher, Vajra-Bodhi. He had, according to the story, he had retrieved the full Vajra-Peak Sutra of 100,000 lines, this kind of like full cycle of texts, we could say. And while he was on his way back to China on a ship, he was hit by a storm, and they were like, oh, well, we're taking on water. We got to start throwing things overboard to. All right, so like I said, we don't know where this story came from about Vajra-Bodhi losing the sutra, but it is quite possible that whoever either came up with it, was influenced by older stories and different mythology around losing these scrolls, or it actually happened, which is a possibility. Like we don't really know for sure. I like to believe that it actually happened because that's more fun, but but that's how it goes. And you mentioned something earlier that was interesting about kind of this story, this Puranic story about this seed of knowledge getting retrieved that kind of became the tantric tantric knowledge or paved the way for tantric knowledge.
Oh, yes. The Matsendranath, who is a very important Mahasiddha in Tibetan Buddhism. I don't know his place in Japanese Buddhism, but he is considered sort of considered to be the one whom Vajrasattva first revealed some of the more exterior, and I'm saying exterior, but I'm still referring to tantric techniques, so they're secret, but they're the more exterior things like tumo, yab like consort yoga, and different kinds of ideas. So Vajrasattva appeared before Matsendranath and revealed to him these teachings. So it's like exactly like what you said, like the pointing out instruction, but then he also has retrieved the physical texts from the stomach of the whale. So you have this idea of both happening, and then there's another idea that Matsendranath is also Vajrasattva. So that's very Buddhist, like very non-dual kind of thinking, but it is kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah. Well, that reminded me of like this concept of ideas kind of existing for very long periods of time and then just taking different shape later on. You see this come up even in like exoteric writing. So like Nichiren, he was of the belief that the Taoist classics, so like the Tao Te Ching and all those in that same kind of like similar vein, that they were like kind of proto-Buddhist texts. Like they had been they were meant to lay the groundwork for Buddhism, which is that was Nietzsche at claimed at least. But that's kind of like a similar idea, which is very interesting. And Nietzsche actually quotes, I think, Chuangzi, the story about the butterfly in his writing.
I actually, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say these texts were actually heavily studied in Japan by Buddhist monks.
I totally agree with that. It's even something that when I first started, like even just looking at Japanese Buddhism, especially esoteric, because that's what I'm interested in, superficially, I would see these kinds, like especially in Onmyodo and the Yamabushi mountain kind of like Buddhist Shinto mixture. I think that you see this idea of Taoism be a kind of proto-Buddhism. I think that's a very common view, even in Chinese Buddhism of the time. I think one of the writings of Zhuangzi, he discusses how the I Ching is, I believe it's translated as a novel template. So a novel template to add on to Buddhism, or a novel template to use to describe certain things. And definitely Zen did borrow, well, not maybe Japanese Zen, but Chinese Zen, Chan Buddhism, borrowed a lot of the language of Taoism, even Tantric as well did, into kind of the more metaphysics. So the Taoist thing, I think, is a very important and often misunderstood kind of like proto-Buddhism. And I think I actually really like that idea. I know some people might not agree, but I think it's very strong. I think there's a very strong case to be made for that being the case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then I guess we should move on to if you have any other inquiries.
Oh, I thought I did write down the Tattva Samgraha, subjugation of the four families. I just thought we'd briefly touch that if you want, because I thought that's very interesting. And then this idea of Vajrapani being the subjugating deity for the the Maheshwara, which is Shiva, Brahma, Vishnu, etc. I thought we could just touch on that if you want, but we can totally move on.
No, that's a good idea, because so we've already talked about. So I mentioned they explained the history of this kind of could say a legendary full Vajra-Peak text. So I guess we should get into what the actual texts say, what they have to say.
100%, and also how its relationship with Pranaparamita. I know I'm kind of throwing that in there, but I think it's important just to note that.
Okay, yeah. So so the part that of this Vajra-Peak Sutra that's used in Japanese esoteric Buddhism is the very first part, more specifically the first chapter of the first part, although parts of the other chapters kind of fit into the theology as well. And So I guess I should explain what the sutra is actually about, which is it's a little difficult because it's very symbolic, I guess you could say, and it's very mimetic in how it
That's
communicates
great.
ideas.
That's a great way to describe it. I think all Tantra has that kind of like mimetic, discursive sort of way about it. So yes, yes, it is a challenge, but you've done a great job so far. So I believe in you. You can do it.
Thank you. So this first chapter, it's considered the most important part, and like as the very beginning of the Vajra-Peak cycle of texts. It's considered basically the core of it all, and everything else kind of built off of this. So the actual narrative of the sutra is that there's a bodhisattva who's meditating under the Bodhi tree. And it's meant to parallel Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. And he is having trouble reaching enlightenment, so he asks the Buddhas for help. And so these kind of esoteric cosmic Buddhas come down to him and teach him esoteric methods of attaining enlightenment. And they teach him, like, the way it's described in the sutra is like a form of lunar disc meditation, where you picture a lunar disc and you picture like Sanskrit characters on the lunar disc and things, just all this kind of stuff. And then he reaches enlightenment, and they give him the name of the Vajra realm mandala. And then the narrative shifts to the top of Mount Sumeru very abruptly. It's, like I said, this is very hard to explain. The narrative very abruptly shifts to the peak of Mount Sumeru, and the Buddhas are there, and they kind of summon the exoteric bodhisattvas from the exoteric sutras, and they bestow upon them these like Vajra diamond weapons and give them esoteric names, and there's 16 of them meant to parallel the phases of the moon, and each one of them is like represents an element of enlightenment or Buddha nature, and then they take their place in the mandala. And the kind of key core takeaway from this text is, like I said, they gave this bodhisattva who at the beginning they gave him the name of the Vajra realm mandala, and then they build the Vajra realm mandala itself up on top of Mount Sumeru. So the kind of takeaway is that you become, when you reach enlightenment, you yourself become the Vajra realm mandala, and like all this stuff that it's explaining is like Buddha nature itself. When they have these different bodhisattvas and place them next to the Buddhas in the mandala. So a very kind of interesting, multi-layered narrative here. Like I said, it's one of those things where if you read it by itself, you're not going to understand what the heck it's talking about. So you got to read different commentaries and treatises and stuff that people write about these things. But that's the basics of the Vajra-Peak Sutra. That's the very first part. Like I said, everything else kind of builds off of this.
No, that was really great. You did a really good job with that. It's hard. I mean, I know it's really difficult. I just throw this out there and see what you think, and then we'll move on to the second part. But I wrote down Karl Jaspers, The Axial Age Religion. Karl Jaspers was a German sociologist who sort of looked at the Bronze Age religions, and he came to this idea that Buddhism was this pivotal religion of every axial age, kind of like that. Buddhism not only explains, and as you know this, Buddhism not only explains every age with a different Buddha or with a different kind of shifting of the wheel of time, but then it also appears when humanity needs it to appear. So it's very much like the Vajra-Peak Sutra, like what you're talking about, the Vajra Mandala, sort of like this thing where it's a revelation, and eventually you realize that you're part of the mandala. It's not distinct from you. It's kind of different, but not exterior. But then there is also
but non-dual. Yeah,
exactly. So I just think that that's very interesting. And I don't know if you agree or disagree with Karl, but I think it's a very interesting idea with all, like, how there was a time when Ebola posting was very popular and was very popular. I just think there is something to Buddhism, like putting all the Twitter discourse kayfabe bullshit aside. But there is something very perennialist and interesting about Buddhism and the way it describes kind of the turning of like the human ages, I think. And I think this is a very good sort of, I think you laid out in your essays sort of a case for it, but not, you didn't necessarily have that as your main thesis, but you definitely, I think there's an element of that in it. Would you agree with that or no?
Yeah, but I think there's going to be an element of that within any kind of like study of Buddhism itself, because as like a key, especially when you go to like the Mahayana theology and into Tantra, there's kind of an element of this idea that the ideas being discussed by Buddhism, although they may change shape and the imagery associated with them might change, that the core of it itself is kind of an eternal thing that's going to reemerge depending on the needs of any kind of particular people or particular being, to use a broader term. So I think as far as that kind of idea goes, that this is just kind of like a continually reemerging thing that always comes back around, that's you kind of almost have to believe that if you're going to adhere to the Mahayana and tantric beliefs, especially.
Yeah, I agree
because it's such a prominent feature of those.
100%. I totally agree. Obviously, I agree. It's hard sometimes because it is really an intrinsic sort of belief. Like it is sort of a core Buddhist belief or core Buddhist realization, you could say. And it's very difficult to discuss sometimes because it does sound it is very esoteric in some ways of thinking. That kind of idea of this system that appears in this fundamentally, I'm not going to call it non-Western, but it is not similar necessarily to what we understand even in the esoteric West. It's definitely not similar to the exoteric traditions, but it's not quite similar to the esoteric traditions either. So I think that's really important to say what you just said. So we'll move on, but thank you for entertaining.
And I do want to mention that so this is actually one of the main things in the Lotus Sutra. There's a part where, like at the beginning of the Lotus Sutra, and I am kind of using this just as an excuse to talk about the Lotus Sutra because I love it so much. But so at the beginning of the Lotus Sutra, in every Mahayana sutra, Shakyamuni always has this big assembly of different beings. He's got like gods and demigods and like trolls and goblins, whatever, big massive amount of people. And they start asking him, we want these true teachings, we want the good, give us the good stuff, the real stuff. And he's like, oh, you're not ready for the good stuff. Like that scene from that movie Walk Hard, where he's like, you ain't ready for this. So eventually, so people like end up giving up and leaving. And there's like a kind of core, smaller assembly that stays behind. And Shakyamuni's like, okay, well, now it's time to give this because, those people weren't ready for it. But you guys are ready for it. And he says, everything I've taught until now, these are expedient means. So the Lotus Sutra is really big on this idea of expedient means that, there's certain things that part of Buddhist teachings that aren't permanent. These things aren't going to stay around forever. More superficial things like different stories and comparisons that you can make, different names, things like that. Forms for deities, are going to change. But he says, I'm going to do away with all the expedients, and I'm going to give you the good stuff. I'm going to give you the stuff that really matters. These are the core teachings. And he explains, you might know me as the guy who, I left the palace at the age of, I think, 30. And then I went to meditate under the Bodhi tree and I gained enlightenment. He's like, but that's an expedient. That's expedient means what really happened was I gained enlightenment a long, long time ago in the very, very distant past, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, before history itself. And he goes on this really big, there's like a really long chapter. It's called the Juryo chapter, I think, in Japan, talking about how he, like it's basically Shakyamuni saying, oh, I know I gained enlightenment a long time ago, forever ago. And in this sense, when he says that he's going to do away with expedience, what he's doing is he's casting off this identity of Shakyamuni and is becoming the embodiment. He's speaking as these ideas themselves that consistently reemerge, and this is called sometimes the idea of the eternal Buddha. There's going to be certain ideas and a certain kind of cosmic force, you could say it is, that kind of compels people to know about these things and to learn about themselves and to achieve self-realization. That's always going to be there. And like I said, it's going to take different shapes and different forms, and people are going to give it different names. But this is the real stuff without any expedience. And so that's kind of one of the core ideas of the Lotus Sutra is what we're talking about now.
And I think that that's really important that you brought it up, because I just think that even what we call the exoteric Mahayana sutras, they play such an important role for a tantric understanding as well. They are another huge piece of the puzzle for like having correct view, having correct methodology, having correct like understanding, following the vows, following the oath. It's very important. So yeah, I tend to obviously love the tantra stuff in particular, but the Mahayana stuff is just as cool, just as esoteric. So yeah, that was amazing. Thank you for saying that.
Oh yeah. Any excuse to talk about the Lotus Sutra. But I guess going back to one of your inquiries before, you were wondering something about the four families in the Vajra-Peak Sutra. They had a question about.
Well, I just thought it was so interesting how they had four families, and I know you did discuss this in your article or your essay, how it's usually five families, but they chose to use the four. And I also had a question about the translation for the Amoghasiddhi family, which is, we would generally call that in like a Tibetan to English translation, we would say it's the karma family.
Yeah.
But the Japanese translation tends to be activity, from what I understand.
Yeah. So it's I think action family. But it's essentially the same thing. Karma is created through action. So I think it's just a difference in like there's just different possible translations for these things. That's pretty much it. I don't think there's any real significant meaning to
no,
the
not
name.
at all. I didn't. Yeah, no, totally. I didn't mean that there was. I just think it's interesting that you can use the words like there are action or karma, and they describe, like, I knew immediately what you're talking about, because obviously Amoghasiddhi, green consorts, green Tara, very easy.
Yeah.
Right? It's just very easy to visualize. Just think about immediately. That they're the family of swift action. That's what Amoghasiddhi means: swift action or swift accomplishment. So, I just thought that's very interesting. I like how the Japanese scholars don't follow the traditional or the more conventional Tibetan to English translation, and I think that's actually better, because I think it broadens sort of the understanding. Because I think once you say, oh, karma family, I don't necessarily think that people have this is more meta, but I think that people necessarily have the more specific associations of what that means.
Yeah.
So I think like hearing it like, oh, action family, okay, well, that actually is a verb. It has like a very specific kind of function in Buddhist magic or Buddhist color theory. So yeah, I just wanted to comment that I liked that, and I thought it was interesting. Because Tibetan scholarship tends to be very conventional in its ways. Like there are set ways to translate certain words and all of that. So I just thought that was interesting to note.
Yeah, and some of this is also going to be kind of the time period in which scholars are writing certain things, because over time with Buddhist translation and stuff, certain things kind of become like codified and more well known. Like I mentioned the term expedient means before, and that's one of those things where it kind of came about as like an agreed upon translation over time for, I think it was upaya. And
which we often translate as skillful means, but it's
skillful means is another
thing, right? But it's
exactly the same thing, yeah. But that's one of those things where there's been a ton of different translations for it, and like skillful means and expedient means are the ones that kind of caught on.
Yeah.
And I'm not to like promote Soka Gakkai or anything, because I'm not a big fan of them, but there's a part that I read one of the kind of big guy, Daisaku Ikeda. It's one of like the big names in Soka Gakkai, and he passed away, I think, last year, but he had a series of books that he had written that were kind of like quasi autobiographical. And there's a part that really stuck out to me when he was talking about coming up with like their international division of Soka Gakkai, trying to spread their theology. And he said that they had a lot of problems kind of translating some of the things because like this was before like Nichiren's stuff was widely translated, and a lot of the Mahayana stuff was before a lot of Mahayana stuff was translated. So they didn't have terms for some things like English terms. And so there's like a concept that's really big in Tendai and Nichiren theology called Ichinen Sanzen. And they're like, how are we going to translate this? Like, we don't have a word for it. We got to figure something out. And I think that they agreed upon, like, it was something like 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought or something like that. Some kind of long translation like that. And that's kind of been used since then. But I think that's interesting that you have to kind of, when people start translating some things, there's just no English equivalent and you have to find something. So that's kind of how a lot of this stuff comes into being.
No, you're totally right. And I think that even speaks to the larger discussion of like sort of the discarding of forms, not being so beholden to specific forms of
exactly,
and the names, discarding the names, but also like retaining the meaning, but maybe discarding the exterior name of things.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of adjusting it as needed. If it's not doing the job at communicating what you wanted to communicate, you can switch to something else. And but I mean, going back to we were talking about the 4 families in the Vajra-Peak Sutra. That's kind of an interesting topic because in other works, and I think the Mahavajrayana Sutra is like this. They have 3 different families. And there's like another one that's used, another book that's used in Tendai. I don't remember the name. It's something in Sanskrit, but
okay.
And like one of the main things in that is it's a Kriya Tantra, so it's basically like a spell book. It's what that is.
Mm-hmm.
A ritual manual, you could say. And the central theme is the 3 families. There's different mantras and different rituals, each for the 3 families. And the 3 families in this sense are the Buddha family, which is headed by Vairocana Buddha. Mm-hmm. The Vajra family, which is headed by Akshobhya Buddha.
Mm-hmm.
And the Lotus family, which is headed by Amida or Amitabha. But the Vajra-Peak was notable in that it added a 4th family, which is the Gemstone family. And that's headed by Ratnasambhava. So, but like you said, there's 5 Buddha families, but I think that has to do with there just wasn't a kind of like fully developed set of rituals and mandalas and stuff for this 5th family, so it just was never included.
That totally makes sense, and I just will say about the 3 families, that is. So in Tibetan Buddhism, that is obviously the case as well as in the earliest tantras. It's just 3 families, exactly the ones you said, Vairocana, Akshobhya, and Amitabha. So, but you see a lot of focus, especially in the early Kriya tantras, on Akshobhya in particular. I also thought interesting compared to the Japanese. I mean, obviously he is important, and you do write about that, how he's very important for the protector because he's the dark blue Buddha. So if anyone's thinking of what he looks like, he's the dark blue one. And a lot of the deities in his family are also dark blue and wrathful, very wrathful. So he's associated especially with protector practices, but so can some of the deities in the Amitabha family, obviously. But he is just a very important Buddha, especially for the earlier Buddhist era, the earlier Tantric era.
Yeah, and even later Tantric era, he's kind of like in the kind of around.
Oh yeah, he's around, and he's definitely in the mix. But I mean, as you may know, the Amitabha family, specifically like the red magnetizing practices, those became very, very popular among Nyingma and the Shakya schools. And then the Akshobhya practices tended to be more associated with Gelugpa and some of the Kagyu schools, and then obviously the Vairocana ones you tend to see more in the more stricter monastic practices where they do like Mahamudra instead of like Adi Yoga or Dzogchen. So the more monastic, more structured systems, you will see like Vajrayana be the main focus. But it's very school dependent, and just like all the things with Tibetan Buddhism, it's very text dependent, school dependent, teacher dependent. It's hard to say one thing is the reality and then someone has like a revealed treasure text that says something totally opposite. So. But yeah, no, that's great.
And I mentioned that before that I wanted to ask you questions about some stuff, and that's going to play into that, but we can circle back around in a bit and get back to that.
I'll keep going. I apologize for the.
Oh, no, that's fine. And I'm actually writing a series of essays right now on Akshobhya Buddha and kind of his relationship to Tantra and like, his place in like Japanese Buddhism, all that kind of stuff. Because I think he's a very interesting, multifaceted figure who's not really explored enough. Especially in relation to, there's like a Mahayana sutra called the Vimalakirti Sutra, and he plays a prominent role in that, but it's never really elaborated on in any of the commentaries that I've seen. So I wanted to kind of play off of that, and I don't know, I might turn it into like a full book if it gets long enough, but I don't know, we'll see. But what was I going to say? We're talking about the families. Yeah, so the 5 families. I'm not sure there's much else to say about those. There is interest. It is interesting that the Vajra-Peak Sutra has the inclusion of the Jim family, and the central figure is, rather than Ratnasambhava, the central figure for the mandala, as described in one of the sections of the Vajra-Peak Sutra, is Kokuzo Bosatsu, which is Akasagarbha. Simply because of his prominence in Japanese esoteric Buddhism. I think that's interesting, because I don't know how prominent he is in Tibetan Buddhism, but in Japanese Buddhism, he's considered very auspicious.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but did not Kukai have a specific Ashkarma practice or like mantra recitation? I recall some story about Kukai like reciting the mantra for the void treasury memory, and sort of receiving a transmission or a teaching from like the single recitation of the mantra. Obviously, that is a more apocryphal story, but I'm not doubting Kukai. I'm not saying that. I'm saying for people listening. But no, he is. So we do follow obviously Mahayana has the 8 great bodhisattvas. There are obviously more than 8, but 8 is the magic number, right? For Buddhism, a lot of times. 9 as well, but 8 is very important as well. So he is important, and you will see him a lot in China and a lot in Chinese, like Mahayana iconography, and he's usually paired as a brother with Kishtigarbha, who I think is Jizo.
Yep.
But in Tibetan specifically, like he appears, but he's not. There's no particular emphasis. I'm not really his Manjushri is just the most important in Tibetan Buddhism. Like just cut through it. He's just Manjushri is like he takes on the same role. He takes on the same kind of magical functions, all of that. So he's just the premier, I'd say.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of Manjushri. He's a cool guy.
He is a cool
that's another very multifaceted figure that you could do like just hours of content on.
100%. You could do a whole series on him for sure.
As far as, but so you mentioned the practice that Kukai did. So that's very interesting, because before even esoteric Buddhism was properly implemented in Japan, one of the esoteric practices that made its way over is around Kokuzo Bosatsu, or Akasagarbha. And it's a practice where one goes out into like the mountains or the forest, some place of seclusion, and says his mantra like 1,000,000 times or something like that. I don't remember how many times it was.
Probably 8 times.
Yeah. And the idea behind this is that it's supposed to give you better mental acuity and make it so you can memorize sutras better, memorize mantras better, and just better memory, better thinking ability. And this was actually, if I'm remembering it right, This was actually Kukai's first first contact with Buddhism in proper, was coming into contact with like a priest, a Buddhist priest who was doing this practice. So and then later on, after joining the clergy, he has a dream where he is approached by just like a regular man, just very nondescript kind of man, who tells him to go to China and find the Mahavajra Sutra and bring it back to Japan. So, and if you read the Akasagarbha Sutra, it kind of describes this, where Akasagarbha appears in people's dreams and guides them, often as a regular man, just like in the story about Kukai. So the creation of Shingon is actually kind of attributed to Kokuzo, or Akasagarbha, in a way. And I believe there's a story, I haven't found a good source on this, but I think there's also a story about, so Nichiren, when he was initiated into the Tendai, which had esoteric practices. And so he made a vow to Akasagarbha, which was a custom at the time. And I believe he was also visited in dreams by Akasagarbha and encouraged to study certain things about the Lotus Sutra. Like I said, I'm not 100% on that. I have to find a good source, but I did read that in like an academic paper. So you have kind of this theme of Akasagarbha showing up and guiding these like Buddhist patriarchs to like kind of fulfill their mission, which is very interesting. This idea that this bodhisattva is kind of operating just behind the scenes and kind of making things happen when they need to.
Yeah, I love this discussion, because it honestly, even though it isn't necessarily Tibetan in its form, it has very much the same elements as like the later Terma traditions, which people think is just for Nyingma, but it's actually for all the schools have Terma traditions, which are revealed treasures. And revealed treasures are not just things that are found in nature. They are also from dreams or from apparition appearances of specific bodhisattvas, dakinis, Buddhas, whomever. And so this has all of those kind of esoteric elements of transmission. So I love that.
Yeah, I think it's really cool, especially when you're studying these things and you just kind of like come across something, you're kind of hit with like oh, this sounds kind of familiar. It's really fun. I guess moving on from here, if we want to get into more depth of this like legendary 100,000 line Vajra-Peak Sutra cycle. So obviously, so Japanese Buddhism uses the first chapter. This is the very first part of this really big text or collection of texts. And then we talked about the Rishukyo earlier, and that was considered at least a fragment of the sixth part of this. And like I said, that starts to bring in more of like the later tantric elements and the kind of stuff you'd see in Tibetan Buddhism. Not like entirely, but you start seeing these same themes kind of emerge. And then the 15th part of the Vajra-Peak cycle, which there's supposed to be, I think it was 18 parts in total. The 15th part is actually Goya Samaja, which is the main text of the Gelug sect in Tibet, and is considered a part of the later tantras. And this opens up like a huge can of worms, because obviously you have this Buddhist school like halfway across the world who's using this text as their primary text, and then you have the one in Japan using the first part of the Vajra-Peak cycle as theirs. And then when you look at documents by Kukai and Amoghavajra, they list, oh, and then there's this other book that's connected to ours called Goya Samaja, and it's like, wait, what? It's like these people didn't have access to the full sutra, the Goya Samaja Sutra. So this is like a very kind of profound, revelation that these two texts are connected so intimately. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, it makes sense to me. It makes sense to me the history that you laid out, the history in the Great Amoghavajra book that you cited in your essay. Yeah, I think he lays it out as well. I think that there is sort of this connection to Sichuan, to China, to the diffusion of certain texts that aren't necessarily called the same name or the correct name or different names, and that makes sense to me just looking at Indian Tantra as well. Like I'm talking non-Buddhist Tantra, but because you can look at some of the Bhairava, the Yogini Tantras, some of the Kubjika Tantras from Nepal, they are Buddhist. Some of them are very Buddhist. Like you can immediately tell they're almost the exact same text.
Yeah.
But then they just have slight tweaks, like slight cosmological tweaks. Like instead of it being like a cosmic Buddha, it will be some cosmic form of Shiva. Or it will be, if they're centered on Kubjika, and instead of calling her like Kamakhya, which is what her name is in India, they will call her Kubjika, but then they'll also refer to her as Chamunda. I mean, there's all these kinds of like very, I don't want to say syncretic because it isn't really syncretic. That's not really the right word, but there is an element of where they're piecing together something and then they're diffusing it outwards again from this kind of Himalayan region, and then it's spreading into China, and then China is doing the state supported, just like Japan did, I think, in the later eras. You're more obviously an expert on that. I'm definitely not an expert in Japan at all, but they, they had state sponsored ministries or ministries of rights and ministries of Buddhism. So you have this kind of financialization, this kind of I always forget the name. It's like a system where they support the practitioners and support the famous teachers. So you have this kind of production of sutras, production of tantras, translations happening, and it's all state supported. So then you obviously were going to have all these different translations, all these different diffusions into the various libraries of Central and East Asia. I think that makes complete sense.
Oh yeah, yeah, and like I think we spoke on the last podcast that we did together, where a lot of this happened in a very short amount of time,
Yes.
speaking theologically. And so you had all these ideas just come into prominence very quickly and get adopted very quickly and diffused very quickly. And so there's like a huge kind of corpus of text with all discussing these same ideas and themes and just kind of, changing it slightly and building off of other ones. And so there's a huge web of connection. And that's kind of what in my essay series, it's you can see a lot of that with these different texts. Like we don't know for sure if these all were meant to be part of one big kind of sutra collection, but even if they aren't, the through line there's like a through line that goes through all of them that it's very clear, as far as like you can see like a progression of the ideas and how they develop further and things like that.
No, 100. You're totally right. I totally agree that there's a through line, a sort of like arrow of knowledge to sort of like that links one end to the other, like links all of Asia together. It's kind of the pre-Pan-Asianism of Pan-Asianism. So there is something very really interesting there, and it's also pre-Mongolian. So I just want to point that out, that even though yes, Guhya Samaja is the principal text of Gelugpa, which is the main school in Mongolia, this was pre-Mongolia being Buddhist. I mean, yes, of course, they had monasteries in Central Asia and North Asia and Northern China, but it didn't happen until like the 16th, 17th centuries. So you're really looking at something that had a bit of a disconnect in terms of geography, but you do have sort of the connection in Korea, which I have not explored yet, like at all. But I think there is something really interesting that was obviously happening in that kind of peninsular or a sort of port city, China, Korea area.
Yeah, that's something I have to research more as well. Because when you hear about a lot of the not just in Buddhist theology, but like on Myodo stuff. So Taoist things like that kind of filtered into Japan. A lot of it comes through the Korean Peninsula. So that was definitely a hot spot for that kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%. And then also, I think we should touch on the skull ritual if you want, because I think that is probably one of the most similar in terms of like esoteric rites that's explained. I think that's very similar to Tibetan Buddhism in many ways, as well as the dakini stuff, which we could definitely touch on as well.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about this, well, I guess before we start talking about these kind of later tantric things, I should say, so we touched upon There's the first Vajra-Peak text, which is the one used by Japanese Shingon, just to review. Sixth part is related to the Rishukyo, also used by Japanese Shingon. 15th part, Guya Samaja, used in Tibetan Buddhism, mainly the Gaelic school. And then there's another text. So this is in Amoghavajra and Kukai's lists. This is listed as the 9th text. However, I think I would put it chronologically after Guya Samaja, just because of how similar it is to later tantric works. But it's called the Sarvabhuta Samayoga Dakini Jala Samvara Sutra. That's very long, but it basically translates to something about
Sanskrit.
Oh, thank you. It translates into something like the dakini net that binds together all of the Buddhas, something like that.
Yeah.
And we'll call it the Sama Yoga for short, I guess, because that seems to be what a lot of academics use as kind of the nickname for it. And this text, like I said, it has a lot of the elements of later tantric works. So it introduces kind of the charnel ground stuff that you see a lot. Introduces kind of rituals done with like human bones and like skulls and stuff that different that they would have access to on charnel grounds. And it introduces at least the name dakini, but I don't think it uses it. I couldn't find an English translation of this text, just FYI. So my knowledge of it is only pieced together through like studies I've read on it. But it introduces the name dakini, but not in like the same context as Tibetan Buddhism would use it.
I just will jump in there and say that I think that if you're looking for like a capital D dakini, as in like a goddess name or like a Buddha name, I think that you're right that it's not the same. But we do have also the idea of the kind of the carnal ground lowercase d dakinis who just are like wrathful witches of the carnal ground. So that does exist, like unenlightened beings.
Well, as far as I understand it, like I said, I'm not entirely sure on this because I've had to piece it together. But it uses it as like a verb, I think. I guess the word dakini, it translates to something like sky dancer. So it uses it in something like that sense. I really wish I could have gotten more information on this particular topic for my essay series, but I just didn't.
No, I totally get it. And, that is how dakini is also used in the Tibetan text. Like it can be a verb, can be a noun, can refer to human, women, can refer to like deities, it can refer to Buddhas, it has a whole range of like uses and meanings. So it's and all the scholars who do Tibetan Buddhism, especially like the yogini texts, they all say the same thing that you're saying. Like it's very difficult to really pin down exactly what was being referred to. Like, can you make inferences? Sure, but it can be nebulous, a term. So
yeah,
I
and
think you did a good job.
Yeah, and when I had to like research dakinis for the essay, and that was one of the things I found very quickly was that it's very hard to pin down what exactly you're talking about when you say the word dakini. But so I guess, but there is kind of like this kind of idea that is introduced that ends up being kind of associated with the word dakini, which is like these certain goddesses that one could like spiritually enter into union with in kind of like they call it the great bliss of enlightenment. So that idea is introduced in the Sama Yoga Sutra. And this was one thing that I wanted to ask you about before we get to like the skull ritual and everything. So apparently, there's another thing I'm not entirely sure on, but I think the Sama Yoga Sutra is the first proper introduction of the wrathful deity Herika into like the Buddhist canon. It's like I said, it's hard to pin down exactly if that's the case, but just from what I've read, it seems like it may be.
So I will just say that I think it is also maybe. Like again, like when you're looking, so there's a whole series of tantric texts that only exist in portion, just like in Japan. And like we have like the mandalas still exist, like we know what the idea of them, maybe oral transmissions still exist, and definitely still exist in the lineage of lives. You can go look up the for Chemchok Haruka, I'm thinking specifically. That was the much earlier kind of formation of the 6th, 7th, and 8th century mandalas. So people don't really use that Haruka very much anymore. But we know that the idea existed from like those earlier times as well. So I'm not sure. I'd say that is totally possible. Just like with everything with Buddhism, it can be very nebulous, because one text will say this, and then they will discover another text written in like Songdian or Chocharian or Chinese, or or they'll have some reference to a Sanskrit text that they haven't discovered in some Tibetan library somewhere.
Yeah.
So, it's hard, but we'll agree that that is likely.
And another thing I want to ask, so researching, much like dakinis, researching Haruka is a little difficult because the name is used in different contexts. And as far as I'm aware, you have later works called like the Vajra Tantra and the Chakra Samvara Tantra. The Chakra Samvara Tantra actually references directly the Sama Yoga Sutra that we're talking about.
Because the dakini is such an important. That's the one of the first tantras where she. I have to be careful of how I phrase this. It's one of the first texts where she becomes a primary meditational deity of her by herself. Like, she does exist. Like, I'm not saying that there isn't other, like in Vajra, there is a dakini that is her own meditational deity. Yes, that's true, Naraima. But in terms of Chakra Samvara, she very much becomes specific. She's associated with specific color, specific functions, and she becomes a whole Buddha, sort of like
specifically Vajra Yogini.
Sorry, go
ahead. That's specifically,
yes, or not.
Yeah. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. But I guess so. Chakra Samvara is the figure, the wrathful figure that engages in union with Vajra Yogini by himself. He is named Haruka, right?
So he is Chakra Samvara Haruka. So if you're going to write it in Sanskrit, you would just do, write it in English, you would just hyphenate his name. So just like you would do with Akashobhya Vajra from the Guhya Samadra, you would just write Akashobhya Vajra Haruka. And then you would do his consort, Sparsha Vajra, or Adi Prana Haruka. So all the wrathful deities become Harukas. That's how they're always thought of. Even if the principal text doesn't necessarily refer to them as such, because of Tibetan iconography is so iconographically dependent, Tibetan Buddhism. So they are always depicted as having fangs, having the wrathful or semi-wrathful faces, even if they're placid. So they always have that association with Haruka, but it is particularly associated with blood drinking. I know that's the Chinese trend, like that's more the Chinese translation, blood drinker. But I think that that's actually correct. I think that is, maybe not direct from the Sanskrit, but I think that's a good understanding. Because once you understand what they're saying in the more secret layers, even in the inner layers, it doesn't have that same connotation. But I think that's a good way to understand what they're talking about, just in my opinion. I know that.
Gotcha. No, that does clear at least a little bit up. As far as I'm aware, as far as like the Sama Yoga Sutra goes, Haruka is kind of depicted as a specific kind of wrathful deity, same as like Gozanze Myo or Trilokya Vijaya, I think it's pronounced the Sanskrit name.
Yes.
I never said that one out loud before.
No, that's okay. That happens all the time. I totally get it.
So Gozanze that's easier name, so I'm just gonna go with that. So he's depicted in the first part of the Vajra-Peak Sutra as a manifestation of Vajrapani, or alternatively, you could say Vajrasattva, because the two tend to kind of get conflated with each other in tantric texts. Who subdues Mahesvara, who is like this kind
Shiva.
of,
We can call him Shiva.
you can
That's who
Shiva.
they're referring to, but sometimes it can be. I understand why you're saying because it can be, people get offended, and then also what are you really meaning? But you really explained this very well in your essay, so I will just say that everybody go read it right now. But you talked about this in the story of the ash, sort of like the burning to ash and then being reformed in the Dharma.
Yeah. So, I guess in Gozanze's case, he goes to where Mahesvara is, and he steps on him, and he instantly reincarnates him into a Buddhist form. And that's kind of his myth arc, is that, and he's even in statues. If you go to Japan, you see statues of Gozanze. He's treading on Mahesvara and his consort. But Heruka in the Samayoga Sutra seems to have kind of a similar myth arc to him as his own kind of wrathful deity, where, like you said, he reduces the universe to ash and reincarnates it again. During this theoretical end time where all the gods have basically gone insane due to the influence of Mara. And so it seems that he is kind of like his own figure in this sense. But then when you're talking about Tibetan Buddhism, you say oh, well, this is so and so Heruka, this is Chakrasamvara Heruka, this is Chimchak Heruka. So it seems that the name Heruka is kind of interpreted in a different sense within Tibetan Buddhism than it would be, as far as I'm aware, in the Samayoga Sutra.
I will defer to you on this. I don't really have a strong opinion. I just think, but I do think that I think that the story that you're relating about, yes, and Vajrapani and Vajrasattva, there is that is again very Buddhist, very nebulous. But I do think there's something very interesting about having Vajrapani being the sort of subjugating deity, because he is really the first, even though he's a exoteric bodhisattva, he also is very important for esoteric Buddhism. And you just see him as a very important yaksha king who is subjugated by, it's said to be by the Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, in his era, and then he's kind of secretly passed on as a subjugating practice for subjugating other yakshas. So he is then sent against the Vedic gods to kind of exactly like what you said, subjugate them and turn them into sort of dharmic forces. So I'd say he's really a core character, and even in the Chimchak Heruka Mandala, he is, after the visualization of Chimchak, he is the inner core of Chimchak. He is it all comes down to the one, like the Matrix, kind of. So, no, I find that very fascinating. And I don't know if you have anything else to add to that one. I'm sorry I went off on another tangent about Vajrapani, but he's very cool.
Oh, no, I think that is interesting, yeah. And I can see the connection there. And it's also interesting that, like I said, Vajrapani is often conflated with Vajrasattva. In the Mahavajrayana Sutra I read, Vajrasattva, the name, they actually call Vajrasattva, who he's clearly Vajrasattva in the narrative, but they call him Vajrapani, I believe. So I have to wonder what the connection is. That's one thing I haven't really pinned down, or why the names are used interchangeably like that, because they're very different conceptually.
Yes, 100%. But I do think, Vajrasattva, like you were saying at the very beginning, he is conceptualized, or you didn't say this, but Vajrasattva is conceptualized on a moon disk. The mandala you described is all the deities are conceptualized on a moon disk. Vajrapani is not conceptualized on a moon disk. So I think that's very interesting as well. If you're doing him as a deity meditation, like Ishta yoga. So there's something very interesting there. And he is sort of the preliminary practice. He's kind of like the, a lot of your essays about liminality and marginality, I think we referenced the Gaetan, I forgot his name, I'm sorry, but you referenced an essay in your essay about the liminality and marginality of esoteric Buddhism. That's what Vajrapani is. He's kind of the exoteric figure who is able to traverse into the carnal ground and subjugate the sort of suffering-causing deities and the wrathful forces of the world. So he's kind of a guide in a way.
Interesting. Which is, Vajrasattva is also considered a guide in a different sense.
Yes. Yes, because he teaches the purification and rectification practices. So they're very, I would say, even though they're very, yes, and you're right, they're totally conceptually, they're quite distinct. But they definitely have a relationship in that one teaches maybe the subjugating kind of bijas or the subjugating syllables, and then Vajrasattva teaches more of the purification practices. So you're able to undertake the rites of subjugation. I think
that is interesting. And there's also another kind of relationship with Samanta Vajra and Vajrasattva as well, where Samanta Vajra is considered a different exoteric manifestation of Vajrasattva.
Yes.
I mean, this is kind of in the weeds of the esoteric stuff.
Yeah, I know. I love this. I could talk about this all day and every little facet of it. But we'll just we'll touch on the skull ritual, the Mahakala, and we'll end on Dakini, and if that's okay with you.
Yeah. And I also will say as far as Vajrapani goes, I think so Gozanze Myo, the one who subjugates Mahaspara, he's considered in the text, he's said to be a manifestation of Vajrapani. In Japanese Shingon theology, there is a something called, I think this was passed on from, it's like a legacy thing from the Chinese esoteric practices, but there's something called the triple ring theory. And under the triple ring theory, you'd have Yamantaka, who in Tibetan theology, he's considered a manifestation of Manjushri. And but in the triple ring theory, he's both Manjushri and Amida. He has elements of both. Under this theory, you could say that Gozanze Myo, he's a manifestation of both Vajrapani and of Akshobhya Buddha, which is also interesting because Gozanze is the head of the Vajra family mandala in the first part of the Vajra-Peak Sutra. Like I said, Akasagarbha is the head of the Gem mandala. Well, the Vajra mandala has Gozanze as its head. So you got another interesting connection there with, Vajrapani, Vajrapani being literally holder of the Vajra. And then later on, Akshobhya Buddha, he becomes known as the holder of the Vajra when you're dealing with the five Buddhas and their implements. So another very interesting connection. And that's something, like I said, I've been writing a little bit on Akshobhya Buddha lately, and I might touch on that as well. I kind of briefly mention it. I posted a passage from it on Twitter where I kind of briefly mention it, but that might be worth exploring as well.
Well, when you've written that, I urge you to come back and tell us about it, have a discussion with me, more for my own pleasure. But, I also will point out that Vajrasattva also holds the Dorji or the Vajra. So there's another kind of implement relationship, and people might just think, oh, that's just like a iconographical similarity. But actually, as I'm sure you know, there's a deeper relationship when they are shown with the same implement.
Yeah, and there's also different Vajra family mandalas where Vajrasattva is the head of them. So there's a very, very kind of intimate relationship between all of these Vajra holding deities. And in esoteric thought, the Bodhisattvas and the Buddhas have a very close relationship as well, with the Buddhas being the manifestation or kind of the embodiment of emptiness, and the Bodhisattvas being kind of the active force in between emptiness and transformational reality that acts upon the wisdom of they're the practice on part of the theory So you have the bodhisattvas being the practice, and then the theory being the Buddhas, kind of, if you want to conceptualize it in a kind of a simple way.
I think that's a great way. I think that was very well described. Yes, and I agree with everything that you said. I think it can be very difficult, but I think that that's a great way to think of it, as the wrathful deities really appear in the practice.
Yeah.
Very accurate.
Yeah, and of course with the wrathful deities and both the wrathful deities and the bodhisattvas being the practice, which there are two sides of the practice. You got the bodhisattvas as the more peaceful face of compassion, and then you have the wrathful deities being more subjugating and destroying the evil spirits and the forces of Mara and things like that.
Yes. 100% agree. And I also think it was interesting how in Japanese Buddhism, this is probably the biggest difference, and people might not understand why I'm picking on this specific instance, but the Mahakala, the black Mahakala, I think that's what you said in the essay, is the subjugating deity of the dakinis, and sometimes also the yakshinis and the other yakshas of the carnal ground. So that is true in Tibetan Buddhism, but it's also not true in Tibetan Buddhism. So I think that's really interesting. If you want to touch on that, I think would be really, people would get a lot out of that.
So as far as I'm aware, so there's two faces. So Tibetan Buddhism has a ton of different Mahakalas. It's a kind of class of wrathful deity, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. I use like a singular because it's just easier, I think, in like a cosmological map. But yes, you're totally right. It's multiple. Originally, I believe they are called Yaksha kings, who become time kings through various stories, probably of destroying Rudra by Rava. But obviously, the later tantras expand him out, and he becomes like different characters. And then there's like a 6-arm form, a white form, different forms. But yeah, he's originally like very similar to a Vajra-Pani, like a Yaksha king who subjugates the Lord of Time, who's a form of Shiva or Maheshvara, and that's who he becomes. And he becomes Mahakala, which is the greater time or the greater time king.
There's kind of a similar thing in Japanese Buddhism, but Mahakala has two forms.
Okay.
One of them is Daikokuten, who is one of the 7 lucky gods of Japanese religion, not just Buddhism, but everything. They have kind of a collection of 7 gods. There's a lot of like art of them. You can buy like little toys in their shape. They're just like they're very, very popular. So Daikokuten is one of them, and he looks so Mahakala is a big monster, right?
Pretty much.
So Daikokuten looks like Santa Claus. So he's got like he wears like nobleman's clothes, and he's like a little portly man, and he has a sack over his shoulder like Santa Claus, and he has a magic mallet that when he hits things with it, he can like create gold coins or like turn things into gold and stuff like that.
Honestly, yeah, he is sweet looking, but I do think there's similarity between him and Vajrapani, and then him also and the white Mahakala practice, because the white Mahakala practice is the wealth granting Mahakala. So I do think that there is probably a very close relationship between those two ideas, regardless of form.
Yeah. Well, Mahakala in general is a destroyer of obstacles, and obviously, if you're in poverty, that's kind of an obstacle for you. So you have these kind of similar 100%. Ideas,
and also the portliness. No, you're totally right. And I just want to say the potbelly thing, the Lambo Daraya, is very important, and it would symbolize like a fullness of skillful means, if you're thinking of it in a more tantric way. But then you could also think of it in a more worldly way as well, as in like you're full of nourishment for Dharma, or full of nourishment in a worldly way of food.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, very much so. And so that's the most popular form. And so Mahakala, like you said, it can mean great time. The other translation of that name is the Great Black God.
Mm-hmm.
So Daikokuten literally means big black god. So it's a literal. His name is a literal translation of one of the meanings of Mahakala, which is very fascinating. And then you have like the other version of Mahakala, which is the tantric version. And you can see this version in the womb realm mandala, the Taizokai, which is like I said, one of the two main mandalas of Shingon Buddhism and Tendai esoteric practices. And he's up in the very, very top left corner, along with he's right next to Shoten, who is Ganesha.
That makes
basically.
sense.
So yeah, the two they're often depicted as a pair, I believe. And also Mahakala is often depicted holding an elephant skin, and this is true in the Taizokai mandala, because one of the functions of Ganesha is as a creator of obstacles, and then Mahakala is the destroyer of obstacles. So he's going to have, he's going to destroy the creator of obstacles, and then the creator of obstacles is going to create more obstacles. And there's like kind of like a non-dual element between these two that we could definitely go into some other time.
No, we definitely should do an episode on like the Buddhist Ganapati and just his whole thing. And yes, all of this, that what you just said, is exactly preserved in Tibetan Tantra as well. Like Mahakala is the subjugating deity of Ganesha. He wears the elephant skin of the Asuric form of Ganesha. So not maybe Ganesha, the Buddhist deity, but maybe the Hindu Ganesha, you could say.
Yeah. Or
the Asuric form, however you interpret that. So yeah, totally exactly what you said. We have the same thing. So I love that.
This form in the Taizokai mandala is the other form of Mahakala, and this one is the more preserved form that hasn't been turned into like basically Santa Claus. But I think both forms are valid. I think one of the reasons why I think Daikokuten is so interesting is the idea that he has this kind of very friendly, like kind of exoteric form that kind of like brings wealth and destroys obstacles for people, and then he has like this esoteric form that's meant to like lead people further towards the Dharma, kind of like this very interesting dynamic between the two forms.
I totally agree, and I will also just point out that there is what we'll call a tantric like Hindu form, which is Swarnakarshana Bhairavaya. He is kind of a intermediary form between like the earlier sort of Rudra Bhairava and then like the later kind of like Ashta Bhairava, or the 8 forms of God of Time. But he is also a wealth practice, and it's very similar. He even has this very similar color to the quote unquote white Mahakala, and he grants wealth to Kubera, a very important Buddhist deity as well. So another like element of him having the wealth granting function, and he's considered to be much more like a happier Shiva, happier version of Bhairava. Like not a world destroyer per se. Of course, his blessing can, you don't make him upset, but yes, I mean, generally he's much happier. So I do think that there's also like an Indian element that is also part of the connection. I haven't quite worked it out. I'm sure that you and I can come up with something and eventually, but I thought I'd mention it just because I don't think it gets mentioned very often in scholarship, but it does exist, and it's a very important form of Bhairava and Mahakala in general.
Yeah, and I'll have to wrap this up pretty quick.
Yeah, no problem.
So we could cover we can briefly cover the skull ritual that you're talking about earlier.
Yeah, why don't we do that? And then you can then you can plug all your stuff, and then we'll call it a day.
Okay, cool. So the skull ritual. So I had mentioned that we should probably save this for later because this skull things with skulls and bones and stuff don't get introduced until very late into the Vajra-Peak cycle. So like I said, the Sama Yoga Sutra is like kind of the first hints of that coming into play. But there are some interesting parallels that I bring up there is a group, a school of Shingon called Tachikawa Ryu. And within this school, there were some strange kind of heterodox texts being passed around. And they're very shrouded in mystery now because they've been destroyed, as far as we know. But there was a monk named Shinjo, who you mentioned earlier, who had written a book about his kind of investigation into these strange texts that he found after being initiated into Tachikawa Ryu. And one of them had to do with, and this was kind of like the one people wanted an example of, like, okay, well, what did these texts say? So this skull ritual that he described was kind of his proof, saying this is the kind of stuff that was in these and why I decided to come forward with them. And he describes this skull ritual where it would be like a sexual, like, I guess they would take like a human skull, and that would be the central point of worship in this theoretical ritual, and then they would do sexual rituals around it and then decorate the skull, and then, like, I guess I forget how long it takes. It would take like 7 years to complete it, something like crazy like that. And then they would have to like decorate the skull with like gold and different jewels and things like that. And then at one point there's like the text mentions like a craftsman when it didn't before, like, oh, you'd have to like pay the craftsman to do this, and be like, wait, what? So there's a lot of like weird kind of stuff in this account, which I mean, if we're taking Shinjo at his word, which let's just do that for this conversation, then this text would have some like kind of, it's obviously very off in different ways, but so and then I guess the idea would be that the skull, after you do this ritual for years, it would have like a dakini appear inside of it, and it would like give you like, secret knowledge or something like that. I forget the detail, the specifics of it, but that's kind of like the idea. They had this very strange skull ritual, and like even Shinjo mentions something like this. He's like, I doubt anybody's actually done this because it seems to be impossible. But the interesting part about it is that this idea of using kind of sexual ritual and the use of human skulls in a ritual is something that you wouldn't see in Japanese Buddhism, because, like I said, none of those things were ever passed on in like texts or anything, or any kind of lineage. So you have this kind of thing coming out of nowhere, which resembles in some ways, at least, superficially at least, some later tantric themes.
I loved actually what Shinjo said, you included it in your essay about like, even if a man was able to accomplish this ritual, he would only be granted a city that would be, I'm paraphrasing, but would be a transient thing that would be like the setting of a sun or like a lightning strike. It would just be transient in the world. It would not be, like, it's an impermanent idea. You would be granted the city, but then it would come and go. So even if you ask for a worldly boon, it might not really be worth it. I think that's sort of what he's saying.
Yeah, and in general, like the theology of these texts that he was talking about was just off in that kind of same way, where they seem to be like a kind of distortion or misunderstanding of the actual like ideas within actual Buddhist texts.
The idea of the skull being like the receptacle for the nectar, though, which it would be sort of the liquid of knowledge, which would obviously be related to the consort, but also Mahakala. Mahakala in Tibetan iconography also holds a skull cup, so that is very interesting. But so does the dakini. So you have these two very parallel kinds of ideas, and obviously the dakini arises from the skull cup in this ritual. So there's something very interesting there with it.
Yeah.
And, I love the idea of the sort of transgressiveness, but then also the impossibility. Like, like a lot of tantric ideas, like, it's very difficult to accomplish the ritual as laid out. So maybe there's a secret idea or a way to kind of like cipher out the full ritual from this longer sort of prescription. So
and according to Shinjo, there were like some rituals involving skulls that seem to be easier to accomplish. Mm-hmm. So, and there's that element as well. And the Tachikawa Ryu stuff. So obviously Tachikawa Ryu as a school, it got the blame of this. which probably was not right, because it seemed to be like a small splinter group within Tachikawa Ryu that these things were really like circulating around. But the full, like the entirety of the Tachikawa Ryu school ended up getting the blowback from it, and they were banned, and all of their texts were destroyed. But a lot of people became interested in this topic because of it has these kind of like at least superficial similarities to some of the later tantric stuff and things you see in like the Tibetan Buddhist text. And but the problem with it is we know that those texts probably weren't circulating in Japan at the time, and even if some of this stuff was actually passed to Japan, we don't know for sure because, like I said, the texts were destroyed. So so that makes it kind of a frustrating thing to research, because it's, there's no history there anymore. It's pretty much all gone. I think some mainline Tachikawa Ryu stuff survived, but as far as this like splinter group stuff and like the supposedly heterodox teachings that they were passing around, we really have no idea what they had to say. So we only have, like people like Shinjo, like his account of what they said.
Well, I'll ask you one last question, just a quick one. Do you think the ritual transgressive nature, because I remember being an undergrad and taking intro to Japanese history, and just the idea was the ritual purity and impurity being so important to Japanese theology in general, or cosmology. Do you think that this would have been particularly horrifying for the audience at the time, or sort of the public at the time? This sort of transgressive ritual?
Probably. But that's only because, like I said, the idea of monastic discipline is, even in the esoteric schools, was kind of held in high regard. So it was actually shocking at the time when these things were published, and they were kind of, Shinjo's accounts actually were later on kind of used as a cudgel against the Tachikawa Ryu school, which I guess there was some kind of conspiracy between people who like different scheming of like monastics who had it out for the Tachikawa Ryu school and like the heads of it. So there's some like political stuff there. But yeah, they basically used this account as a weapon against the Tachikawa Ryu school. So they knew that, well, if we show people this and we tell them that Tachikawa Ryu is responsible, then people are going to be shocked enough to where we can basically wipe them out of existence, and that's what happened. So yeah, I would say definitely it was pretty shocking in general.
I mean, that's a fascinating history in and of itself, like this whole hidden sect, and you're going to have to, obviously, you're honestly welcome anytime to come back, but why don't you plug all your stuff, and yeah, we'll figure out another time to do part 2, and I want to hear what you have to say about Bato Kanon. I'm particularly fascinated by Hayagriva, by the Dakini 10, all of that, so we'll definitely have to do a part 2, but for now, I'll let you sort of plug your stuff, and then we'll call it a day.
All right, awesome. Yeah, thanks again for letting me on. You can find me on Twitter at JIGOKUCAKE, Jigoku Cake. Links to my stuff are there. My pinned tweet has the link to my Substack, that's Spiraled Seas. And in my bio, you can find the link to the Gumroad page for Hungry Ghost books, and you can find the hardcover copies of those books on Amazon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, this is Jin the Ninja, and if you enjoyed the show, you can check out more episodes on Spotify and Anchor, and you can check me out on Twitter at Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn, and on Instagram at Threshold Saints. And there's a link tree in the show notes, so you can check out all my appearances and my shows to date.